Hi, everyone. We're really excited to have Dr. Casey Cushman here from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I want to welcome everyone who's tuning in online. We're really happy to have you, and if you have any questions for Casey after the seminar, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box on Zoom. So Casey is a forest ecologist who is really seeking to understand the drivers in the spatial variation and function and structure of forests globally. And she works at this really interesting junction between traditional forest ecology methods and a variety of remote sensing technologies. And from a talk that I've seen Casey give before, she has a really keen understanding of where the field has been in the past with traditional inventories, and then also where the field is going. Casey completed her bachelor's at Swarthmore College in biology and minored in engineering and mathematics, and then she completed her PhD at Brown, and then went off to do a postdoc at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And she also gave, before I even met her, she gave one of my favorite talks at ESA in 2018 on the role of canopy structure in above ground net primary production. And I'm really excited to see what Casey has to show us today. Without further ado.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm really happy to be here to be able to talk to everyone about my research using remote sensing and specifically here drones to study forest ecology. And I'm currently a postdoc at the Jet Propulsion Lab in California, but there's a disclaimer on the slide here, and I'm supposed to say that the work that I'm presenting today was done in my capacity at other institutions. My research is broadly motivated by a need to better understand carbon cycling in forests globally. There's been a lot of attention recently about the potential ability of forests to either mitigate effects of climate change in the future or potentially exacerbate the effects of climate change. But a lot of uncertainty remains about how different forests might respond to the ongoing global change. And I think that a lot of this uncertainty comes from the fact that it's really difficult to actually measure carbon in forests. So this is a picture of the understory of the forest taken at Manaus in the Brazilian Amazon. And you can see that for some of these ecosystems, there are a lot of trees. Structurally, it's very complex. And if you think about trying to go out and actually measure how much carbon is here, it's a really difficult task. One of the most fundamental methods that has been used in the past to do this is forest inventory plots. So in these plots within a given area on the ground, each individual tree has been, its location is measured, its diameter is measured, its species is identified. And this is used in order to estimate the amount of carbon in an area. So the plot that I'm showing here is, to my knowledge, the oldest known data set from a forest inventory plot that comes from the Czech Republic in the 1850s. And here all of the circles and the tiny dots show the location and size of trees. And here they've also tracked dead wood that's on the ground. And it's striking because it's a really beautiful picture. It's also striking to me because over 170 years later, we really use these same basic methods in a lot of forest plots globally. And these kinds of data sets have been hugely useful in terms of asking a lot of ecological questions and tracking change over time. But for the specific questions of trying to quantify the global carbon cycle, these plots cover a tiny, tiny fraction of the Earth's surface because it's such a labor-intensive method. And so it leaves a lot of uncertainty and questions about really what's happening over larger scales. I got my start in forest ecology research working in ground plots like this through the Smithsonian Forest Geo Network. And I got to travel to plots in a few different countries, and it was a great experience. And in my project, I was trying to better measure large tree size in order to estimate carbon dynamics in tropical forests. And it really struck me that for some kinds of measurements, being on the ground makes it really hard to measure what you want to see. So for instance, measuring tree height and canopy shape and some of these metrics that are really important for understanding carbon are just really difficult, even when you are on the ground looking at these organisms in a complex system. And so from that experience, I got personally interested in using remote sensing as a way to study forests. So in remote sensing, we use instruments on usually satellites or airplanes, or as I'll talk about on drones, in order to make measurements and study ecosystems for forest ecology. And these kinds of data can be really helpful for looking at these large scale processes. So in the image here, it's from the MODIS satellite. We're looking at the southern extent of the Amazon, and you can see the dark green areas are showing where the edge of the Amazon extends compared to other kinds of ecosystem types. And you can get a sense of how these really large scale changes in ecosystems can be seen using these more traditional types of remote sensing data. But here, every pixel is a couple 100 meters across. So it's much larger than the size of an individual tree. So while these data are also useful for some questions, if you're interested in really the organismal processes that underlie a lot of these ecological questions, there are a lot of limitations to these kinds of data as well. So in a lot of my research, I've used drones in order to bridge the scales that you can address with either traditional field data or traditional remote sensing data. And it really can act as a bridge between these two kinds of tools that have been used in the past. So like field measurements, you can actually see and study individual trees. And like more traditional remote sensing measurements, you can study processes that happen over larger scales. So today I'll talk about 3 different projects that I've worked on that use drones in order to kind of connect these scales and learn more about how forests function and how we can study them. So I'll talk about a project looking at how we can measure forest biomass from space and how that's affected by leaf phenology. A project looking into the consequences of blowdown disturbances in tropical forests. And then finally, a project looking at how soils and topography are important for disturbances across tropical forest landscapes. So I'll start out with a project looking at how changes in leaf area affect how we can measure forests from space. Right now, there's an instrument that's on board the International Space Station that's called the Global Ecosystems Dynamics Investigation, or JEDI. And JEDI is a big laser, so you can see the instrument itself on the left, that is shooting towards the Earth in order to measure the structure of ecosystems globally. And one of the major goals of this project is to measure ecosystem structure in order to better quantify carbon dynamics. So this schematic shows the kind of data that are collected by JEDI. So like I said, it's a LiDAR instrument. So it's a laser, and when these laser beams reach the Earth, they're about 25 meters in diameter. So the cartoon in the right shows what the scale of each measurement looks like. And then JEDI measures the reflection of that laser energy from the vegetation. So it produces a measurement that we call a waveform that's shown here on the left. And it basically shows us the distribution of vegetation that's reflecting energy within the footprint of the laser here. So you can see energy reflected by the top of the canopy and then a signal from the ground as well. So JEDI is measuring forest structure, and one of the most striking features of forest structure in areas with deciduous plants is the presence or absence of leaves. So in forests like the ones that are around here and a lot of North America, a lot of plants are deciduous. So over time, going from summer to winter, the leaf area can change. And here you can, see the ground when there are no leaves. You can't see through to the ground during the summer period. So I think it's kind of intuitive that the presence or absence of leaves affects how light moves through an ecosystem. And therefore, we would also expect it to affect measurements from JEDI because it's affecting how that laser energy is reflected when it reaches the Earth. So in order to actually measure or estimate biomass from JEDI, they have a calibration data set. So these are data that were collected before the satellite launched, and that was used to develop the models that are used by JEDI to actually estimate biomass. So this plot just shows the locations around the world where these calibration data were collected. And one feature of the calibration data is that they're only in forests that have a deciduous period. All of the calibration data come from a time when the forests had leaves on them, so during the summer or leaf-on period. And because of this, when JEDI produces biomass data products, only measurements from JEDI that are collected during leaf-on periods are used to actually estimate biomass. So what this basically means is that for any area of the world that's not evergreen and has deciduous vegetation, so anywhere that's not red on this map, some of JEDI's data are essentially just sort of thrown out or not used for the actual estimation of biomass. And so this project was motivated by trying to understand, could we actually use those data so that there are basically more data available to have a better constraint on forest carbon dynamics. So in order to do that, we asked first, how sensitive are JEDI data actually to changes in leaf area over time? And then second, what are the consequences of those differences in data when we actually estimate biomass using JEDI? So in order to answer these questions, we did a campaign with this helicopter style drone that you see here. That's called the Ground Platform for Autonomous Remote Sensing. So this is a pretty large drone. It's actually gasoline powered. So you can see the gas tanks under the propeller here. And it also carries its own LiDAR laser instrument. So that's what's sticking out of the red box on the bottom. And this is a platform that we were able to deploy in order to collect laser data and basically simulate what the JEDI instrument would see. So we did a campaign in the Jofin Forest Dynamics plot, which is a really large ground plot within the Smithsonian Forest Geo Network in the southern central Czech Republic. And we collected data twice during 2018. So in April, just before the leaves started to come out on the trees, and then again in June when all of the trees were fully leafed out. And here using a drone was really helpful because we were able to do this very kind of targeted remote sensing data collection in a way over a large landscape in a way that would be really expensive and difficult to organize using more traditional tools. So this is what the data from that drone platform look like. So it does look just sort of like a cartoon of a forest, but if you zoom in, you can see that these images are made up of many individual dots that are all 3D measurements from the much smaller laser from the drone, taking measurements in the canopy here. And also, if you zoom in here on this part of the trunk, you can see that we have differences in the data between the leaf off and leaf on conditions as we would expect. So when there are leaves on the trees on the right in green, you can see that the points are sparser on the trunks as more of those lasers are reflected by the leaves in the canopy and don't reach as far into tree trunks and also onto the ground. So we can simulate what JEDI would measure in this spot. So I should also say that each of these kind of circles in the forest are the size of one JEDI footprint, so one JEDI measurement. And this is what the instrument would see here. So again, as we would expect, we have a higher signal in the canopy when there are leaves because there's more leaves reflecting that laser energy back. And then towards the ground, you have the opposite pattern where during the leaf off condition, you see a really strong ground return and less of the laser is reaching the bottom of the canopy when there are leaves. So to actually work with JEDI data, because these waveforms are very kind of multi-dimensional, so this curve is translated into a series of discrete metrics in order to actually use the data in models generally, and these are called relative height metrics, and they describe the height above the ground that a given proportion of the energy is returned from. So basically at the 50 relative height metric of 50, that means that it's the height where half of the area under this curve is above it and half is below it. So the higher relative height metrics correspond to the top of the canopy vegetation structure, and the lower ones are the bottom of the canopy. And so we see kind of the same pattern here where the leaf on data are always taller than the leaf off data because you have those leaves reflecting the energy higher up. So this is just one location, and we simulated JEDI data for every location throughout this large forest plot in order to look at, across areas of different structure, how do these JEDI, our relative height metrics, tend to be affected by the presence or absence of leaves. So what we find is that looking here, each panel is a different height metric. Again, the lower ones are bottom of vegetation versus top of vegetation. And the leaf on data are always taller than the leaf off data, so they're falling to the right of this line. But we see that some of these metrics are more affected than others. So at the top of the canopy, there's a small difference between the leaf on and leaf off data. And at the bottom of the canopy, there's a pretty large difference in terms of what JEDI is actually measuring. So next, we wanted to look at, we see these differences in what the data look like. What are the actual consequences for estimating biomass of these measurements in different conditions? So to do this, we used the actual models that are used by the JEDI project. So they've done a big model selection effort using the calibration data and have recently this year published the models that JEDI uses to actually estimate biomass at the level of these individual measurements. And we used, the models are specific to different biomes, and we used a set of 80 models that have been previously selected by the project as the best models. So they all are multiple linear models using these relative height metrics to estimate biomass. And they are categorized into kind of different scenarios that the team has chosen that might be useful. So in the first scenario, any of these relative height metrics could be used. In the second one, they exclude the lower canopy metrics, less than 50. The third, all models are forced to have the highest metric of RH98, relative height 98. And then in the last, both constraints 2 and 3 are applied. So they can't have any of the low metrics and are forced to have the high metrics as well. So how we use these models to look at bias from changing leaf area phenology. So again, all of the models were created only using these leaf on data from different sites around the world. So we call that, I call it leaf on models. So we either apply the leaf on data to these leaf on models to get a leaf on estimated biomass, which is again how the models were really designed to be used. And we compare that to what happens if instead we plug our leaf off data into these models to get a leaf off estimated biomass. And then I've calculated bias as for each individual footprint in the forest, the difference between the leaf off and leaf on estimated biomass, and then we kind of average it for the whole area to get one number of bias for each of these models. And what we found is that applying the leaf on models to leaf off data, so this is the, not how the data are currently used, underestimates biomass by between 1 and 20%. And this makes sense because in general, taller areas have more biomass is basically the phenomenon that underlies the models. So if you have shorter data when there are no leaves, then you underestimate biomass. But what's interesting is that we see this really large range of variation in the bias among the models. So some models really have a very small bias, and others are affected by it as much as about 20%. And what's interesting to me when I first saw this is that among these kind of groups of models limiting which metrics are present or not, the opposite pattern to what I expect showed up. So I was expecting, because the lower canopy metrics are the most biased, that if you exclude those, then the models should work better. But we actually see the opposite. So in the two scenarios that restrict the use of those lower canopy metrics, we see the highest amount of bias. So I was really curious to see what was actually going on with the models where this is happening. And the answer is that these models contain often multiple terms. So what's happening in models with very little bias is that you have the bias in the measurements kind of canceling out. So here, it might be a little hard to see, but this table has the top 10 models with the least bias, and all of the negative coefficients are in red compared to the positive coefficients, which are in black. So in all of the best, almost all of these best models, you have both negative and positive terms, where essentially the bias in the actual relative height metrics is canceling out and resulting in a pretty low overall bias. And there's only one model that shows up here that has a single term, and that is the tallest relative height 98% metric. And again, that's the term that was least biased. So just to summarize, we found that JEDI data are affected by leaf area, and the upper canopy metrics are less affected than the lower canopy metrics. And we found that there is bias, but that using leaf-off data might be possible for JEDI if we're very careful about model selection, or potentially come up with some kind of way to use other information about whether the leaf condition of an area to correct for this bias. So this project is, a little bit methodological, I would say, but I do think that it's a nice example of how we can use drones to very selectively design remote sensing studies in order to better support and understand the kinds of measurements that we get from space, and to really understand how these ecological processes that we see on the ground affect what we measure at kind of larger scales from remote sensing studies. So next I'll talk about a project looking at blowdown disturbances in tropical forests. So blowdowns are disturbances that occur mostly in near the equator and in tropical forests, particularly in the Americas, where large convective storms come through and big bursts of wind come straight down and can kill many trees at once. So the largest of these systems can sweep across the Amazon basin, for instance, and kill kind of millions of trees in one blow. And here on the screen, we can see high resolution satellite data before and after one of these events. So before, it's kind of a carpet of green in the forest, and after, we see these big brown splotches that affect multiple kilometers of forests, where almost all of the trees are knocked down and killed. And there's been some discussion in recent years about whether these events really matter for carbon dynamics in tropical forests overall. So we know that they can kill a lot of trees, but they're also very rare. So there's arguments that they're so rare that, yes, they're very destructive, they cause a lot of mortality, but potentially they're so rare that, like, overall, when you're looking at tropical forests, they don't actually matter that much. And it's an important question because there's a lot of concern that storms will become more frequent with global climate change, and therefore might really kind of disrupt the carbon balance in the region. So there's definitely an interest in understanding, just how important are these now, and how important do we expect it to be in the future. And one of the reasons that this has been a hard question to answer is because these events are relatively rare, so we often lack good before data. So if you want to know how much carbon is lost in this kind of an event, you really need to know what was there beforehand. And if it's affecting an area where there aren't any baseline measurements, it's difficult to address that. But there was a relatively small blowdown event that happened to strike the La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica in 2018. So in the days after the event, Orlando Vargas, who's a collaborator on this study, hiked I think it's 30-something kilometers of trails at La Selva and marked where each individual tree fell down. And those are all denoted by red dots here. And he found over 600 new tree falls just along the trails of La Selva. So you can see that there were a ton of trees that got knocked down and that it mostly affected kind of this lower area of the research station. So following this event, we went down with the same helicopter drone platform and again took LiDAR measurement of the forest structure. And this was in some way a fortuitous event because it luckily missed a lot of the community nearby. And also because La Selva actually has a pretty long history of existing LiDAR measurements of forest structure. So in this case, we actually did have a good before and after comparison in order to look at the effects of this event. So I compared the canopy height before here and after the blowdown. This is just an example kind of spot in the forest where you can see both some trees that survived the event. So if you look at like this one here, before and after, but you can see in this large patch in the center that a lot of trees were killed as well. So in general, height correlates really well with above ground carbon. So we compared the height before and after in these data in order to make a map of how much carbon was lost during this event. And so what we see is that on average in this area where the reserve was most affected by the blowdown event, that we lost about 20% of the above ground carbon. And it's spatially heterogeneous. So there are some areas with pretty high biomass loss, other areas where there was actually a gain in carbon. So there's some secondary forest in that region as well. But on average, about 20% of the above ground biomass was lost in this event. We did a kind of back of the envelope calculation using other data about regrowth of forests after big disturbance events and plot data from La Selva to estimate how long we think it will take the forest to recover that 20% of carbon. And this isn't inherently a pretty uncertain calculation, so we did it a couple ways to get a range, but we think that it will take at least a few decades in order for the forest to regain the carbon that was lost in this event. So we think it was a really significant event for the carbon dynamics of La Selva. I want to talk for a second about how these events are usually studied in tropical forests where events don't happen to strike a pretty well-known research station. So in general, a lot of research into blowdowns and their frequency and carbon consequences has been done using Landsat satellite data. So Landsat has 30-meter pixels and a pretty long record. And how this is used is they're able to look at essentially kind of the brownness of pixels in order to estimate what's called the proportion of non-photosynthetic vegetation. So that's basically like how much of that pixel is wood versus leaves. So if a lot of trees are knocked down, then that proportion increases, which is along the x-axis here on this graph. So in the picture you see, this is a before and after color where the after is artificially colored so that areas with a high increase in non-photosynthetic vegetation shows up as red. So they mapped this from the satellite data and then went out into the field to estimate on the ground how much mortality occurred in pixels with different proportions of this metric. And they found a very good correlation where you see increase in non-photosynthetic vegetation in the satellite data, you also see high mortality in the ground data. And so this has been used to look at the frequency and consequences of these events. So I wanted to see, do you see this event at La Selva? in the satellite data, and does it correlate with what we found with the detailed LiDAR measurements of carbon loss. So I applied this method to this area, and what I found is that we did have a statistically significant increase in the proportion of non-photosynthetic vegetation, but it really didn't correlate with our estimates of biomass loss across the landscape at all. If anything, there's a very slight negative trend, so not what we expect. And what I want to point out is that while we did find an increase in non-photosynthetic vegetation, the x-axes of these graphs are very different. So if we rescale my data to match what is shown on the graph here, we see that it was an increase, but it was super tiny compared to what was measured in other blowdown events in previous studies. So we have pixels that have really high biomass loss across the landscape, where you have almost no signal in the satellite data. So how does this happen? There are two things that are important for causing this pattern. The first is that a lot of moist tropical forests have very high cloud cover, and that can obscure the data. So at La Selva, our first cloud-free image after this storm actually wasn't until over 6 months after the blowdown took place. So there's a pretty large time delay. In the parts of the Amazon, for instance, that have the highest frequency of blowdowns are also the cloudiest places. So it makes it really hard to use these kinds of data sets. So this image, for instance, is a Landsat image that was in a published paper used to quantify blowdowns. And you can see that large parts of the landscape are still obscured by clouds. And the second thing that's important is that a lot of tropical forests have really fast recovery. So basically, you're measuring how green things are essentially from the satellite. And if you have vegetation that really quickly goes into these gaps in the forest, this signal from these kinds of disturbances could get lost before you have an opportunity to quantify them using satellite data. So there is definitely opportunity to do better at monitoring these kinds of events from space using new technology. So in particular, there are higher resolution satellites that are measuring the globe daily or near daily that could be used and really increase your chance of having a cloud-free observation. So this is an example of a planet satellite image. So this is a couple meter resolution, images the Earth daily. And we were able to get an image just a couple weeks after this event. And so here you can see, in this after image that we do have these large brown splotches where it does seem like this event is more visible in these newer kinds of satellite data. But I do want to point out that I think there's still a lot of challenges in using these data as well. So here we have, again, the ground observations in this spot are the pink dots. And while we do, have some agreement with the brown spots in the satellite data, there are also some areas where we see high mortality in the ground data, but it still doesn't really show up. So even a pretty high resolution satellite, I think there's still a lot of challenges in detecting things and also just dealing with like the huge volume of data. So I think there's promise, but it's definitely an area that's an active area of research and where methods development is needed still. So what we found overall in this study is that we're able to show that even in this relatively small blowdown that is totally missed by satellite data, that we can have pretty significant carbon loss and that it will cause the forest to have to take a few decades in order to recover to its previous state. So I think that there's a lot that's still outstanding about this question of how important are these events really for overall tropical carbon balance. But I think that we can say for sure that it seems like our estimates of the prevalence of these events has probably been underestimated to some extent just with these more traditional satellite based methods. So I think that definitely more work is needed to say whether they're really consequential or not overall. And also this is another project where having the flexibility of using drones in order to go right after this event and collect data over a large area was really allowed these measurements to be taken efficiently over a pretty large landscape in order to study the aftermath of this event. So in my last example for today, I'll talk about another project where we use drone data instead of these kind of really targeted campaigns with specific kind of discrete questions in mind, more as a monitoring tool to be able to really extend the kinds of monitoring measurements that have previously been done in plots over a larger landscape. And this is work that I did with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute at Barrow, Colorado Island, where a few people at Cary have worked before and continue to work. And BCI, as it's known, has one of the longest monitored and largest forest plots globally. So it's a 50-hectare plot, which is 1 kilometer by half a kilometer, that has been recensused since the early 80s and is really extensively studied. And one thing that's interesting about the plot is that it's on this central part of the island that's relatively flat, and this right-hand plot shows different soil types and is, compared to the whole island, relatively homogeneous in its soil properties as well. And that's been helpful for the plot to control for some of those factors. But in terms of understanding forest mortality, topography and soils, we expect to be important. So BCI is also a nice system because you have a lot of variation in topography and soils, which you can see here. So if we're able to get measurements over this larger area, then it's a nice study system for trying to understand how topography and soils, which we expect to be important for forest mortality, actually affect disturbance events and mortality. And we expect these things to be important because of how plants can access water and nutrients, and also for the kind of physical disturbances across the landscape, exposure to wind, that sort of thing. So in this study, we considered a few different metrics of topography. So curvature, that tells you if you're kind of in a valley or on a ridge. Slope, so whether you're in a flat or steep area. Height above nearest drainage, which is basically how close you are to a stream that affects access to water. And then a couple of different metrics of soil form and geological soil parent material, and then forest age as well. So in order to quantify mortality across the island, we used drone photogrammetry to create 3D models of canopy height. So instead of the huge drone with a laser that I showed in my last projects, here we used actually a small drone with just a regular RGB point and shoot camera. And from taking many, many overlapping images across the island, we're able to make not only an orthomosaic, so one giant picture of the island, but actually we're able to get 3D canopy height information as well. So that's shown on the right. Here, this kind of looked like an image of the forest, but here it's actually a bunch of 3D points as well. And on the bottom, those points are, on the top, they're colored by the image, and on the bottom, it's colored by the height above ground. So we see the red kind of taller canopies versus the blue spots where you can see through to the ground. And we use these data to locate canopy disturbances across the whole landscape of BCI. So here's an example of an event where a few trees fell. So on the left, you can see the images before and after when these trees fell, and you can see the smaller trees in the understory. And we can also see that event showing up looking at the changing canopy height. So we identified disturbances based on large contiguous areas where canopy height decreased over time. And using this method in an automated way across the whole island, we were able to identify over 11,000 new canopy disturbances in a 5-year period using 3 data sets between 2015 and 2020. So this is a huge data set that would be pretty much impossible to do by ground surveys in the same period. And interestingly, we had an average disturbance rate of around 2% per year overall, which agrees pretty well with the ground plot-based estimates of tree mortality for Panama historically. So one thing I want to point out is this large disturbance that hit the southern peninsula of BCI in the second period that I thought at first must be a mistake in how we were processing the data, or maybe the data were bad quality. But it turns out that we actually do see that disturbance in the high resolution satellite data as well. So it does seem to be a real event. So here in the planet high resolution data, we can see, so our disturbances are outlined in orange here, and it does show up in the satellite data as well. And we visited it on the ground after a COVID delay when we could get back in the field, and even 2 years after there were a ton of fallen trees on the ground, and it was clear that there had actually been a big event there. So we started looking at where these disturbances happen spatially and whether they do seem to be associated with the factors that we expect to be important. So in this plot on the top row, we see the distribution of canopy height in different classes of soils and forest age. So we do see that these factors are important for the overall structure of the forest. You see differences between these classes. And on the bottom are how our observed disturbance rates vary among these classes. And we do see consistent differences, basically controlling for initial canopy height along the x-axis, but you see that some of these classes have consistently higher disturbance rates than others. So both in soil classes and also in forest age. So it does seem like the factors that we expect to be important are important. And here we were looking at these in isolation, but we wanted to know really altogether what factors are most important for controlling variation in disturbance rates. So in order to do that, we used an integrated nested Laplace approximation model, or INLA. And this allows us to simultaneously consider all of these factors that we expect might be important, and to also incorporate random effects for spatial autocorrelation. So when we apply this model, we found that the model was able to pretty well reflect what we observed in our data. So the top panels show the agreement between our modeled and observed data at different spatial resolutions. So we see a very good agreement when we have our fixed effects of topography and soils and our random spatial effects. And if you look at just the fixed effects, so of that, how much is really driven by soil topography, forest age, we see that at larger spatial resolutions that we have up to about half of the variation seems to be explained by soils, topography, and forest age. And so I think it's good because it shows that these things that we think are important. I think that also it's interesting that we see a higher correlation at larger spatial grains, because it really underlies the fact that it's important to study these processes over large spatial scales in order for some of these patterns to emerge strongly. So the plot at the bottom shows how important relatively these different effects were. And it also shows we fit some alternative models. So fitting one model for all years together, fitting the two time periods separately, excluding that big blowdown event. And in general, the effects were pretty consistent in these different ways that we could do the model. So this figure here, particularly in the bottom right, shows spatially how our predicted disturbance rate varies across BCI. And so in general, we can see the highest disturbance rates on the western part of the island and lower disturbance rates on the eastern part of the island. And this variation in predicted disturbance rates is about fourfold at this resolution. So one thing that's kind of apparent from this is that the most important factors for driving these large patterns are the soil categories, and then almost important is forest age. So these polygons that you see up here are really controlling a lot of the spatial variation across BCI. So we saw that some of these were higher than others, and that disturbances are higher in old growth forests than in secondary forests. But within each of these categories, so within these polygons, we do see some secondary variation that's associated with topography as well. So in particular, this is a 1 by 1 kilometer example area to demonstrate this. So this area is all one parent soil type and forest age. And so this allows us to look at, what are the associations with topography. So we found that the factors that are most closely related are curvature and slope. So we saw highest disturbance in low curvature, which just means like local depressions and valleys compared to ridges had lower disturbance rates. And we see the highest disturbance rates on the steepest slopes on BCI. And then we found less of an association with these drainage networks across the island. So I do want to talk a little bit about what these results mean in terms of the mechanisms that could be causing these patterns across BCI. So this first set has to do with our result that soils seem to be very important. So some of the ways that this might be causing higher or lower disturbance rates and mortality is that the physical properties of soil contribute to how easy it is for a tree to be uprooted if it's exposed to wind in a storm. And some of these soil parent materials also have these really hard layers that prevent the trees from rooting as deeply, and that can also control how strongly it's anchored into the ground. And then lastly, in central Panama, we know that differences in soils are associated with differences in species composition that could be modulating some of these effects as well. So topography was also secondarily important. So this can be important. So we had higher disturbances in valleys that often can get waterlogged, which can also make trees more susceptible to being knocked over. And then also these topographic patterns can be important for how species are, how deeply rooted they can be as well, and also how exposed they are to wind effects that can knock trees over as well. And that also might be important for these differences that we see between old growth and secondary forests, where secondary forests tend to be a little more uniform in height, which can kind of shield trees from wind effects compared to the older forests as well. So last we wanted to see, we measured these variations and disturbances across the island. We can see how they relate to soils and topography, and we wanted to know, are they really important for the standing structure and carbon cycling in the forest? So to do that, we compared our predicted disturbance rates and our observed disturbance rates with LiDAR measures of canopy height from 6 years before the study period. So we think it's sort of an independent measure of forest structure from our data set. So we looked at the percent of low canopy area, and which is how gappy the forest is, and also the mean canopy height that correlates with above ground biomass to see how well these seem to correspond to our modeled disturbance rates. What we found is that for the proportion of low canopy area, so how gappy the forest is or not, that we had really strong correlations both in old growth and secondary forests. And for mean canopy height, which correlates with biomass, we found negative correlation in old growth forests, so that more frequently disturbed areas actually do have lower biomass. But we don't see this pattern in secondary forests or across the island. And another thing that I think is interesting is that here the dashed lines are the correlations with observed disturbances, and the solid lines are the correlations with our predicted values only using the fixed effects. And we actually see stronger relationships with just the fixed effects. So I think that's an indication that the things that we think are important, over time do seem to be kind of controlling these variations in standing canopy structure and above ground biomass across the forest, particularly in the older forest areas. So overall, what we found is that we do see that topography and soils, even within just a single landscape and tropical forest, seem to be important for controlling how patterns of mortality and disturbance. And what we also found is that a lot of these patterns were really emerge or are a lot stronger when we're looking at really large spatial areas. So again, it's really showing the value of using things like drones for monitoring larger areas than we could access by foot in these landscapes in order for really understanding patterns over time. So we had, a few questions starting out, just to recap the projects I talked about. So first, looking at leaf phenology and how that affects our ability to measure biomass from space. Second, using drones to really target a blowdown disturbance in tropical forests to show that these disturbances might be more important for carbon dynamics than we have appreciated in the past. And then last, using drones in order to monitor large areas of forests to understand how disturbances and mortality events, which are kind of stochastic and not necessarily captured really well by smaller plots, vary and relate to topography. So I want to thank collaborators and funding sources on these different projects, and happy to take questions if we have some time still.
An excellent seminar. We have about 6 minutes for questions, so we can start with questions from the audience and then move maybe 2 or 3 from the audience here and then move online. Sure, Evan.
Yeah, really interesting talk, Casey. I was curious related to the JEDI data. How is the processing handle semi-distributed? That's a continuum. Is there like a breakpoint somewhere, or how do you get that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was how the JEDI processing handles semi-deciduousness. Yeah, that's a good point. So, for people who work in the tropics, we have these all marked as evergreen, but we know that like a big canopy that could be an entire JEDI measurement could lose its leaf, at least for part of the year as well. So it's definitely not quite the binary that we showed there. So in the JEDI processing, there's actually, for each individual measurement from JEDI, there's a flag that says whether it's deciduous or not, and that's based on other ancillary data, so optical satellite measurements. So on the footprint level, things are determined to be deciduous or not based on color information. But again, as we can expect in areas that are really cloudy, maybe that ancillary data could vary in how well it captures the actual leaf state. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
Question about that same project. Do you have any sense? So there were a handful of models that really fairly low bias compared to JEDI data for drone version.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sense if you were to reproduce that sort of drone validation study somewhere besides the check forest?
Mm-hmm.
Would those same models still work, or is it different stuff working differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was in the JEDI study as well, there were a few models with really low bias and whether we would expect that to transfer to other sites or not. I think in general, those equations, those models were chosen from a suite of, they initially started with like a few million different models that were considered, and those final sets of best models that we used were chosen because they performed well in leaf on conditions, at least across all of the calibration and validation sites that the project has. So I expect that in terms of, they should all work pretty well for leaf on data. And I expect that for the leaf off data, like we have for the site in the Czech Republic, that it all should be biased more or less like in the same direction. So I expect that those should probably work pretty well at other sites too. Yeah.
Super interesting. It's definitely like a world I'm a little unfamiliar with. And so one of the questions that I really, I guess maybe is a simple question is, how do you deal with kind of estimates of reach that like once that biomass is not associated with trees, is that still incorporated in Jedi, or is it not? It's still sometimes there.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is is leaf litter accounted for in these measurements? Usually no. So a lot of the biomass products from these satellites are often specifically above ground woody biomass. So it's not really considering anything that's off the tree, and also not, directly predicting like how much leaf biomass per se is on or off the trees as well.
Question from the audience. So both spatial and airborne based LiDAR techniques have their own challenges for scaling. So do you have any ideas on where we go from here for remote sensing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so even, these studies that I presented are, I think, helpful for, doing kind of bridging these scales, but do have limitations in that, you have to kind of be physically close to a place in order to fly a drone and collect these data. So in some ways, we try to target the studies to be useful examples, but they're also not global in space. So I think that one thing that would be really helpful is to have more standardized protocols for doing these kinds of drone measurements. So kind of going in the direction of, currently what's done with plot networks, where there's more of an effort to collect consistent data so it can be used to do a more systematic comparison with satellite data in different areas. So I think that would be helpful for sure. Yeah, definitely a challenge with, in my current position, I'm working with calibration and validation of satellite biomass data as well. And it definitely is a challenge that often the spatial scales and resolutions are not necessarily in both the plot data, and sometimes the airborne or drone data is not always ideal for what we would really need on the satellite side as well. So I think that having more communication between people who work on larger scale remote sensing and work more on the plot and the like drone side would be helpful in making these larger scale missions as useful as they could be.
I'll share one more question since it's already noon. Regarding the blowdown work that you presented, do you have any thoughts, or have you ever modeled the minimum total area at which the minimum return frequency would make a difference to like storage of carbon?
That's a good question. I have not done that myself. There have been a couple of papers looking at the size and frequency of these events. So there has been some work on that. I have not done that myself or looked at, how much more frequent would they need to be to convince people that don't think that they're currently important that they are. But I do think that definitely with changes to disturbances and storms with climate change, it's worthwhile to try to get a better handle on that question for sure. Thank you. Thank you all for your time and for your questions.